So today's topic is,
when is it done?
when is it done? And I'm going to leave it to Mark now.
Good morning, everyone. It's a big topic. When is it done? And because I like to sometimes refer to different readings to make my point, I was a bit stuck, to be quite honest, about who I might turn to find a quote or a reading. And I thought, well, let me look at what Agnes Martin may have to say. So I went through some pages, and I came up with a more philosophical aspect to this question. I think I'll start with that, but then we'll go deeper into a more nuts and bolts notion about when is our work done. So I'll just start here. She says that she talks about the importance of recognizing that fear is always present in our practice, in our lives. There are many kinds of fears, and she talks about that. But she also talks, interestingly, about the importance of recognizing that we are always grappling with pride. And this is something you don't hear much in the studios, particularly in academia. It's just not touched upon, but it is fascinating if you think about it. So here she is talking about these two very powerful emotions and that affect our psyche, and I cannot help it that they affect our studio practice. So here's what she has to say about that. She says here that for those who are visual minded, I will say that there seems to be a fine ship at anchor. Fear is the anchor. Convention is the chain. Ghosts stalk the deck. And the sails are filled with pride. And the ship does not move. That's the interesting line. The ship does not move. But then she goes on to say that there are moments for all of us in which the anchor is weighed, and moments in which we learn what it feels like to move freely, not held back by fear or pride. And those moments that can be recalled in all their fine flavor. That notion of being held back by fear and pride. And Maria asked me earlier, well, does this really have anything to do with the question of when it is done? And I think it does. I think that we may not be able to pinpoint those two emotions as we are grappling with that question. But I think part of the problem is that we are fearful of what? Pride is always there, thinking about, oh, what is so-and-so going to think? And I can't wait to show this. And I mean, it's just a very sort of integral part of who we are as human beings. And getting, how should I say this? Getting to set those two emotions aside and just being free with the work is a huge part of knowing when things are done. Because as you all know, there's nothing greater than being lost in the moment. You're feeling like there's a flow going on. Nothing is inhibiting you. Your decisions, right or wrong, are at least part of the process. And you know that eventually you're going to arrive at a point where there's nothing more to be said to the piece. The piece has nothing more to say to you. And that's when you realize this may be done. But that's an important distinction, what I'm saying about this may be done, because in my mind and my experience, time is the great barometer as to when a piece is done. Again, as you all know, you may fall in love with the piece at the end of an important day or week when you're in the studio, and then all of a sudden you look at it the next day or the next week or maybe even the next month and realize, no, there's something quite not right. So I've always believed that time is the great barometer. I'm very guilty, if that's the word, of creating works of art that I felt were done and would live with them for quite some time and realize, okay, there's nothing more to be said here. And then I would even exhibit the work, sign the work, exhibit it, take it, bring it back to the studio, put it back into storage, and then, I don't know, a period of time later, maybe a year or more, take it out, take a look at it, and realize, well, it's okay, but I can do better. And then I'll take that same piece out and I'll turn it upside down and go right back into it and change it absolutely completely so that an entire new image or painting goes on top of what was there before. So there's almost this archaeological history of where I was then and where I am now and present. And that to me has to do more with maturation as an artist. And we all know what that feels like too. You look at work that's older and you may think to yourself, I'm so much further along than that now. Now, a lot of people would never touch that piece and say, you know, that was then, I signed it, it's done. And I respect that. In fact, that's true for most of my work. I remember asking a friend of mine, a colleague, this question: do you ever have any reservations once you say it's done and you've signed it? Do you ever have any reservations when you've looked at it sometime later? And he said, no, absolutely not. For my mind, when it's done, it's done.
So can I just maybe interject here
Please.
a little bit, because I find it interesting what you said in the beginning and bringing fear and pride into this mix, and then now you're talking about the passage of time and maybe even some characteristics, like the way we think about the work is like, okay, now it's done, or I'm going to go back into it.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to go back to what you were saying in the beginning about fear and pride, and then maybe connect to the passage of time, because you know, do we fear that we do not fit into the certain times? Let's say if you created a piece of work, you know, 10 years ago or 15 or even 20 years ago, and you still have it, and now let's say you want to show it, or you want to show it with the gallery, but then you say, oh, well, this doesn't fit into this time. Like right now we have a lot of work that speaks to, you know, some social aspects, or about even politics, or, you know, nature. And so that's like a lot of work now is being made to speak to what this time in history that we're living in brings, right? So do you think that, you know, you would be thinking, well, my work may not be done, even though I finished it 5 years ago, but now it doesn't feel done because now I'm in a different time. So it's almost like, well, I don't think this is good enough, where that fear kind of installs in you and says, oh, I don't know if this is good enough to show anymore because it doesn't belong in this time. You know, kind of just, I don't know, connecting the two. I just find it interesting how many reasons there could be for an artist to feel that the work is or is not done in a certain time and in a certain period of their life, right?
Yeah, and that's why I keep coming back, Maria, to this idea of maturation. I think it has to do with that. I know for a fact that, for instance, when Arts Benicia wants me to show a piece of work for maybe an auction, I have to go back into I'm not going to show the most recent work necessarily. I'm not going to give away the most recent stuff because I feel the best about it. It's the most recent.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bye, Aaron. You're just clocking out.
Oh.
All right. Well, you will catch it up on YouTube.
Yeah, and so I want to not necessarily show the most recent work because I'm still digesting it, and I'm still thinking, yes, this is a strong direction that I'm moving in. And then if I look at work that I've done in the past, I might feel that, okay, I still stand by this work, but I'm not as attached. So there's this idea of attachment coming up as well, which is a part of the whole pride thing. But also there is a fear that if I go too far back in the work, it may not be as strong at all for me. It's okay, I'm not going to touch it again, but it just doesn't have the attachment or the strength.
So we have a question here
yes.
from Mary, which I want to read. Would you agree, or could you clarify the idea that second guessing oneself is attached to that fear and pride or maturation process?
Yeah, second guessing. Yeah, second guessing. I think it comes back to me for these voices. And for me, one of the main ideas or word around this is intentionality, our intention. I think intentionality is the main key here. What do you intend to say? What do you intend to do? And if you can be in the flow, as I call it, in the studio, you're not having too many little voices chattering about what others are going to think, or is this working because so and so is going to see it. You're just doing the best that you know how. And we all know that there are moves that we make in the work that feel absolutely right at the time, and there are moves that we make in the work that feel like, I'm not so sure about that. This is the whole game that we play as artists in doing our work. Are those moments where we feel absolutely correct about what we just did, and there's no doubt. And then there are plenty of times where we make moves in the painting that just for some other reason is not quite right. That's the balance, and it comes down to intentionality, such that when you think you're near the end of the piece, and this also folds into the idea of a beginning and a middle and an end process. When you realize, okay, I am really near the end of this thing. I have worked on it for a long time. I feel like every time I turn this piece or step back from it or look at it in the mirror, not a whole lot more has to happen. Then you know you're nearing the absolute end of this piece. Now, what I haven't talked about, but needs to be talked about, is overworking the piece. And that's something that's absolutely critical and that we all are familiar with. There's overworking the piece, and then there's pieces that are underbaked. So how do we determine that? Again, I come back with the passage of time. You're not going to figure that out in one moment or one day. I think that when you're at the very end of the end, you really need to live with it. You need to look at it all the time or put it away. This is something else. I have a friend, Gustavo Rivera, who I went to do a trade with him once in his studio in San Francisco, and I went to go look at some paintings that were up against the wall, facing towards the wall. I wanted to see if I might be interested, and he says, no, Mark, those are still in the oven, meaning they're still baking in his mind. So either by putting the work away and not looking at it for a while and then bringing it out and seeing it fresh, that gives you a more objective viewpoint, I think. Or the opposite, looking at it every day and turning it upside down, sideways, getting back. My teacher showed me about using a little hand mirror to really reduce it. Jay DeFeo used to do that, to reduce it and look at it reversed. So there's all these ways that you can, quote, look at it objectively. And
you take pictures sometimes.
I take pictures sometimes, and I'll put it on my screen or even look at it in my phone, which reduces it. And I'm able to see it so much better. So again, this whole issue of fear and pride, I don't want to make that the main kernel of today's talk, but it does come into play when we can be free of those voices, whatever those voices are. I think we feel like we're making good decisions. And
I have a comment here from Sheila. She says, I like the freedom to work on old pieces again. And I also leave some older work as a record of where I was then.
Yeah.
I try to listen to my intuition to decide if it's worth my time to rework, redo, or just start new.
Yes, exactly. Well said.
Yeah.
And I think that's terrific to be able to have old work that you feel worked not only at the time, but you can still stand behind. I think that's the phrase I like to use. There are other pieces I look at that I go, oh, that's just horrid. And and there's where my pride kicks in. I don't want people to see that work. I'm going to take it out and I'm going to either burn it or rework it because I just don't want to be associated with failure. There it is. There's the fear. I don't want to be associated with failure or mediocrity. There it is again. I don't want to be associated with mediocrity, work that's less than, and that's definitely a prideful position, I believe.
So judgment is definitely part of the process of assessing when something is done.
Sure.
Judgment from others and judgment from ourselves.
It's inevitable. Agnes Martin calls it the dragon, and you will never slay the dragon, she says. You can put it to rest maybe for moments, put it to sleep, as she says, but you're never going to slay it. Pride and ego are both part and parcel, for better and for worse.
I would like to just maybe check in with everyone and maybe ask the question: do you wrestle with this question? When is it done, or is it easy? Does it come easy to you? And it's like, okay, like Mark's friends, like, I know I'm done. That's it. It's like I brought it to a certain point and then it just let go. Or do you wrestle with this demon, dragon? Always, yes, Yeah.
Always. Yeah.
So it's part of the process, assessing when it's
It is.
time
And
to let it be.
I have to share the Philip Morseberger story. I hope Philip is out there listening someday. So I have a story about a colleague of mine, Philip Morseberger, a wonderful painter who taught at CCA for many years, and now he's retired. And he told me this story. It's a great story about when is it done. He was asked to house sit some friends of his in Berkeley for a few days while they were gone, and he agreed to do so. And while he was there, he was fixing himself a meal one evening, and he took it into the dining room to eat by himself. And they were collectors of art, and they happened to have some of Philip's work. And there in the dining room, he saw across the wall from him one of his pieces that they had collected, but it had been many years since he had seen it. He looked at it, he thought about it, he left the house, he went into his car, went back to his studio, got his paints, his palette, his brushes, etc. And he literally went up to the painting and began to make little tiny adjustments and corrections to the painting that he had not seen in years and that these people had already paid for. It's an outrageous act, but one can't help but laugh and understand the compulsion, and that was a compulsion. So I said to Philip, when I heard this remarkable story, I said, well, what did they say when you told them? He goes, oh, I never told them. And I said, they didn't see it? He goes, no, I just need to make a tiny adjustment. So I think that's really a classic part of this. One of my favorite definitions of when is it done is that sometimes a painting may never be done. Hopefully it just stops at a good place. Well, that's kind of nice too. But clearly the history of art belies that fact. You go into any great gallery or museum and you'll see many great works of art that the artist decided was done, and they are done. There is nothing more to be said. I think part of it too, just on a technical note, and this is when we get into this idea of overworking. I think I want to talk about this for a second. In regards to my students at CCA, I explained to them that when they are starting to enter into the end phase of the painting, whether it's the beginning of the end, the middle, or the end of the end, that they have to do a great deal of looking and not paint. And this is how to avoid overpainting or overdoing the work. That compulsion or compunction to keep at it and keep doing this and that and adding and subtracting, when in fact we have to sometimes really stop and look, like really read the painting and decide this area is absolutely done. There's nothing more I could say. Because if you're constantly working right up to the end and not taking the time to really pause, and I'm talking about for a very long time, could be hours or days or even weeks or months, who knows? That's the key to not overworking the piece, to realize that you just have to stare at this damn thing sometimes for a very long time before you realize what has to be done. So,
and I think what Mary just said in the comments kind of ties to what you're saying right now. Well, yeah, where she said that there is a fight that I experience, which is either I can't work on this anymore, which may indicate completeness or of a sort, or conversely, I do not have what I need in my head to complete it, or I do not have it right now. Like right now I'm done, but if I give it a little break, I might come. I know it's not quite there, but I just don't have it in me right now. Yeah. Yes. How about when you have a show coming up and you feel the piece is not done, but you have no choice but to hang it? I can attest to that.
That just happened. No, it did. I'll be honest. That just happened. I won't say where.
I witnessed it happen.
She witnessed it. I had a piece that I felt was at the end of the end, but wasn't completely 100% sure that it was done. And I'm still not. In fact, when I got it back here at the studio, I looked at it and I thought to myself, okay, I think I know what it needs. But I think that that's, well, first of all, it's me being honest about that. But that's a good question. Boy, now we're getting into the realm of being ethical and honest with ourselves as to what we're willing to stand behind. That was the key. Was I willing to put that painting that I wasn't quite sure, but was I willing to put it into the gallery and stand behind it? And honestly, at that point, I was able to. I was able to say.
So someone is saying that Renee, sorry, is saying I had 2 pieces like that, but they sold anyway. I never said anything.
You have to live with yourself.
But someone said it last night at this event that we were at, and someone said, well, it's done when someone pays for it. It's like someone writes you a check for it and it's done. And why not? If someone likes it as it is.
Yeah, but we know better. We know better. I actually had that happen once, and I was embarrassed about it. That very same thing. Someone came into my studio. I was doing open studio, or no, it wasn't even open studio. He just came in. There was a bunch of work lying around, and there were 3 pieces that he really liked, and brought out a checkbook before I could hardly say anything. And in my mind, I wasn't quite sure if they were absolutely done, but
yeah, so when is it done? When is it done for whom? I mean, obviously the artist has to be pleased and satisfied, but then if someone else really likes it to the point of wanting to have it as it is that a bad thing?
Well, what this is bringing up to my mind is another angle at this whole thing. So, and I'll discuss it, because when I went, those 3 paintings that this person bought, I actually years later saw the work. I went to his apartment and saw the 3 paintings, and I thought to myself, well, they do appear finished at that stage. Could I do more to make them better? I sure could have. But did they look complete at the moment? Yes, they did. So I felt better. But this brings up an issue about how I like to have my students think about working in a painting, which is this. I ask them, here's the problem with certain painters. They'll work on a piece, and certain areas of the painting will become quite finished or detailed, while other areas have hardly begun. And I say to them, that's not so wise. It's better to bring up everything at once so that you can see the relationships between all the parts, and you're looking at the whole thing. The idea is that even if you are in the middle phase of the painting, if you're bringing everything up at once so that all the parts are relating, it may appear to have a, quote, finished or complete look, or a unified look. And that's another angle to this conversation about how one works. But that only holds true up to a point. Clearly, in the middle phase, there's so much more to be done. So, are there any other comments here?
Can I just tell a quick story?
Please.
On your mural that you were painting at your sister's workplace?
Oh, yes, please.
I think it's a great story.
It's a funny story.
About when is it done?
Yes.
And so Mark and I, we just recently met. Before that, maybe, we knew each other for maybe 10 days. And then in between, we were Skyping and all. So all in all, maybe we knew each other maybe a couple of months. And he was doing a mural in North Carolina at his sister's workplace. They just renewed everything, and so they commissioned him to do a piece. It was the ocean and the beach, and then they were placing some brass fish, little.
This is for the North Carolina Coastal Federation. Right. They do work with restoration of wetlands and protecting the wetlands.
Right, so they needed like this mural to then put this fish on top, which had the names of the donors and patrons of
the donor wall.
Donor wall, right. Yeah. Anyway, long story short, Mark takes me there to show me the mural, and he was done. He had, like, he was packing his tools, and the piece was done. And then he stepped out to go get a sandwich or something quickly, and he left me there with his sister, Tracy. And I looked at the mural, and I was like, I don't know.
Trained painter, very good painter, by the way.
And then his sister was saying, what do you think? And I'm like, well, I think there's a little bit of room for improvement. And she looked at me, and she was like, and partly because I'm crazy, and partly because I knew that his sister had my back.
And because you're talented.
And because, well, I thought that there could be just a little bit of touch-ups. And so I did. I got a brush, and I actually went there and started putting some sea foam. Just that transition, between the ocean meets the sand. It was just not quite there. And I'm there doing it, and Mark comes in, and I just feel this presence behind me, just this energy that was like a complete shock. And I don't know, it was just like so scary that I didn't even dare to turn around.
Oh, but you did.
Because I knew that what I was doing was just so daring. And I just heard his sister saying, Mark, just breathe. And so
That's
anyway,
my first big lesson of letting go.
He endured, and yes, finally, well, today we're married and all. But, you know, just to get back to the point where he was done, I was thinking, not quite there yet. And I think to this day, we have a little bit of that dynamic in the studio. He will come to me and say, I'm done. That's it. And I come and I just don't want to say anything. And then he knows that there will be things to be said. And yeah, so I just wanted to share that quick story.
No, it was a great story. I'm also thinking about one other story.
Yes, actually, bravery on both sides. Thank you.
Bravery on both sides. Yeah. No, it was an amazing moment. My sister Tracy fell in love with Maria automatically. I said, Mark, just breathe. So also years ago, I had a painting that I thought was done. I wasn't quite sure. It was a big oil painting, about 4 by 5 feet. And I asked a colleague of mine, Kim Ano, to come in and take a look. I trusted her eyes. She came into the studio and she looked at the painting and she said, you know, it's really close, but there's a passage in the upper right-hand corner, Mark, that feels not quite there for me. Well, what was interesting is that she had identified one of my, quote, precious areas. That's a whole conversation too, in a way, is our little precious areas that we dare not disturb, let alone eradicate. And that's a real stumbling block for a lot of people. They'll have lots of precious areas within a painting and they don't know what to alter or to get rid of. So she identified that area and then she left. And it really irked me because I looked at it for the longest time. She clearly identified one of the most beautiful passages in the painting, but she was correct once I spent time with it in identifying the fact that that passage, that beautiful, precious passage, was not integrating into the whole. That was the key. So this brings up the whole idea of total integration of all the parts into the whole before it's really complete. And the moment I realized that, I realized I had to take a risk. And there's this whole idea of taking risks. I had to take a risk and begin not to eradicate, but I did alter. I toned down certain areas of that precious passage. And it made for a better painting, I have to say. So I would also enter into this conversation. When is it done? The ability to take a risk. The ability to, or also the ability to see if there are some areas that are just so precious that we don't want to touch them or alter them, but in fact may need to be attended to. So I want to offer that into the mix of this conversation.
And I just needed to check what time it was. Yes, yeah. So we have another about 25 minutes, and I want to open this for conversation in a moment. But I wanted to ask you, you teach art, and how do you teach your students to know when something is done, and how do you assess when a student brings a painting that they're working on, if that painting is done, if it has those precious maybe areas that are not working with the rest, and if you think that the painting is done but the student says no, or the other way around. I mean, how do you even communicate something that, as we are seeing now, is pretty personal? Yeah. That feeling on when something is done. How do you communicate that with your students and help them maybe learn to feel and to recognize when a piece is done?
Here's how I do that as best I can. There's a couple things I want to say about that. So the first thing I do is make sure that I have this very long conversation with them about the beginning and the middle and the end of the painting, which is it's about a half an hour discourse. And then we talk about it so that they understand that in the beginning and middle phases of the painting, that's a great time to make lots of changes. It's a time in the beginning, you're blocking things in, the middle, things are coming together. In the end, you're slowing down and making detailed touches. That's encapsulation. So I have a very long conversation with them so that they're clearer, that when they do arrive towards the end phase of the piece, that they really slow things down and that they spend much more time looking at it, turning it upside down, getting the distance from it, and really making very tiny moves, if at all. And I also explained that even though they may think it's done and they bring it into the critique, they may look at it later down the road and realize there's something more to be done, just like my friend Philip. So there's that. However, there's something else I want to add to this. They're young painters, and I explained to them, look, I would rather have you overwork any number of pieces along the way, and through disappointment and even pain and a little bit of suffering, realize through experience how to exercise restraint. I mean, think about it. At the end of the day, it comes down to restraint. When you're at the end of the piece, there is a restraint that is needed in order not to make moves that overwork the piece, to lose the areas that you had.
And courage?
And courage. So I say to them, I would rather have you overwork a number of pieces and then learn restraint through experience than to always come up short, play it safe, be predictable, get the job done, but not really push yourself. So I'm always advocating for my young painters, my students, to, I'm not advocating to overwork, but I'm giving them the permission to fail. As one of my friends, painters, said, dare to fail. I think that's that should be a t-shirt, dare to fail, which is actually a whole topic unto itself.
Right.
Dare
and maybe
to
it's interesting to ask that question now to people listening to us.
Yeah.
Do you dare to fail? And if anyone wants to chime in and talk, so we will not connect your video so you can be in your pajamas. Don't worry about it. We're not going to look at you.
But what if they want to?
But yes, if you want to talk and chime in, ask questions. I'm not in my pajamas. Well, just in case.
Yeah, but if we want to see them, I'd like to see them too.
So yes, if you want to chime in, raise your hand or let us know. Yeah, you can type a message. So I'm just trying to see if there are any hands. Not at the moment, but okay. So anyway, you can, yes, in front of my critique group friends. Sabine, can you just, I'm not sure I understand, or do you understand, Mark? Yes.
Well, why don't you unmute Sabine and see if she wants to say something?
We can ask. Did you want to say something, Sabine? Did you want to talk to the group? Sure. Okay. Let me unmute you, and you can also unmute your microphone.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Can I do it? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Sabine.
Hi. I have a group of friends that I get together with and share paintings, and I feel comfortable sharing with them things that aren't right. They help me figure out what isn't working or anything like that. So those people, I'm happy to fail in front of them.
But others,
is that a double-edged sword to have people?
Well, I guess what I mean is I will show them unfinished work that I wouldn't like put out in a show in public.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But you bring up a very interesting topic within this topic, Sabine, and that is because I encountered this with, for instance, Maria as well, who has a very good eye, and I trust her eye. But here's the point or the question. When we hear a criticism or a critique or a suggestion from others, and particularly if it's someone whose point of view we respect, what happens then? Do we always take that advice? Do we take it under consideration and decide maybe not to do something based on that critique? I think that's a very interesting part of this discussion. I know that it's very easy to be influenced by others, no matter how much experience you've had. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a real problem at times, because you have to, at some point, be willing to listen to the critique or the suggestion, and at the same time, hold true to your own vision. to your own ideas about what it is. This comes back to intentionality. So Maria might come into my studio, as happens sometimes, and near the end make a very specific suggestion. And because she's a good painter, I would listen to it. And sometimes I actually will follow that suggestion. I will. And other times I will ignore it.
Yeah.
And we just will have a Mexican standoff at that point. But that's really critical, what I'm saying, because I think we can be very susceptible. And I would not suggest, I would not recommend always following the advice of others, and even take it further. Some people might come in and say, oh, I love this work. Well, now we're pumped up. There's our pride, where the sails are filled, with pride. Thank you. I know it's done. And then someone else will come in and go, well, no, it's not there. Don't you see you need more of this or less of that? And then now we're feeling fearful and doubtful. Oh, it's not right. So I would urge everyone, including myself, to be very careful about the filters that we have in place around our own intentionality when faced with the criticism or the suggestions of others.
And how we use them.
And how we use them for our benefit. You have to be open on the one hand, and yet you have to be clear about your own intentionality on the other. Mm-hmm. Are you still there, Sabina?
Yes, I am. And I think it took me a long time to figure out who to listen to, because sometimes every one of the 8 people in the group would have a different idea of how I could change the painting or what I could do with it. And sometimes it was just a little bit irritating.
Yeah, right.
But, I think it helps if you have a clear idea of what you're trying to do when you start.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of people who feel like I just, do whatever when I just let myself go. And I tried that, but I could never figure out when I was finished because I didn't know what I was trying to do.
Right. It also helps to work on more than one piece at once. That's something I didn't mention, but that can be very useful, is to have 2 or 3 things going at different stages, so that if you're stuck in one area or not sure, you go to a different piece, which is at a different phase, and that can also help out as well.
And that has helped me a lot, doing that.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I also, it kind of, well, we have comments chiming in, so this is great. And what you just said, Sabine, also brought a thought into my head, and that is, when we're asking for someone's opinion, are we actually asking for someone to confirm what we already have in our mind? Or are we really having an open mind and gathering inputs and then processing, and then maybe creating something out of all of that? Or are we just looking for that confirmation? And if we don't get it, then we get into the disappointment and fear and trusting ourselves and all that.
Yeah.
I would say, if I can answer, I would say for me, a lot of times I'm just kind of wondering if the person I'm talking to who's looking at my work is seeing a problem with the same part of it that I am.
Yeah.
or with a different part that I didn't notice there was something wrong with.
Right. So either a reaffirmation or a new insight.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Sabine. I appreciate the input.
Thank you.
So let's see, we've got a couple more folks. I saw something from Joan and also something from Susan, if they want to chime in.
Right.
So here's Susan.
Susan is busy with the granddaughter who thinks this is boring.
Oh, well.
She's allowed.
Understood. But she says here that she's working on a painting now where she's avoiding precious bits, and it's very freeing when I obliterate them. Boy, I understand that. It is freeing to let go. And it is about letting go. It really is, at the end of the day.
And then we also have Mary, who works alone a lot. So a lot of artists, I guess, spend a lot of hours in the studio alone.
Absolutely.
And they can only check in with themselves.
Absolutely.
Right? And maybe some artists don't even want to show the work to anyone in order to get any kinds of opinions.
Absolutely.
But they want to decide when something is done or not, and then that's it.
Can I read to that? Sure. I agree. So here again is Agnes Martin, and I'll read just a couple of things. Of all the pitfalls in our paths and the tremendous delays and wanderings off the track, I want to say that they are not what they seem to be. I want to say that all that seems like fantastic mistakes are not mistakes, and all that seems like error is not error, and it all has to be done. That which seems like a false step is just the next step. I love that.
Mm.
That which seems like a false step is just the next step. Say to yourselves, I'm going to work in order to see myself and to free myself. That's interesting. While working and in the work, I must be on the alert to see myself. And when I see myself in the work, I will know that it is the work I'm supposed to do. I will not have much time for other people's problems. I will have to be by myself almost all the time, and it will be a quiet life. Not all of us can achieve that, but I think that's really worth considering.
That sounds very meditative in a way.
Yes, right.
Insightful.
The aloneness of our practice. And unless you're someone who collaborates with others, and that's wonderful, it is very much an alone act, a solo act. And ultimately, we have to be the ones to determine when is it done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe we really could hear from one or two more people. When is it done for you? How do you determine when it's done? What is your process of thought? What is your emotional process to know, to answer this question for yourself? Yeah, maybe we do have another about 10 minutes. So we would like to hear from someone else. So you have the little raise hand button on the bottom of your screen.
Or they can type
right next the chat button. If you don't see it, there's the manage participants button where you will have a pop-up, and then all these options are going to be on the bottom of that little pop-up screen. Or you can type in the chat and just say, hey, I want to talk, and we'll unmute your microphone and let you speak. Because I think it would be fun to hear from other people as well.
Yes.
How do you figure this out in your own studio, in your own practice?
I want to add to that. One of the benefits for me for these webinars is to hear from others.
Yes.
Because someone might say something that triggers something for me as well. So it's not just
and for other people.
And for other people. So
Yeah.
I do appreciate that part of the community. It's like
Absolutely.
sitting around a virtual living room and having people offer their thoughts.
Well, when we were starting to think about this idea, it was we were talking about a coffee shop and a tea room combined. So yes, this is kind of a place where we gather and we share as well as maybe learn some things from Mark.
Here's a quote from Susan Sakamoto. She was talking about Agnes Martin, that she made meditative paintings, and Susan says that I find that when my hand isn't able to touch the painting, I have to listen, step back, and consider that it may be done. Yes, that
I love that.
physical resistance of time to step back. And then from Mary, Mark, could you talk a little bit more about comfort versus discomfort in the art making process? This has a lot to do with whether I decide if something is done. It's also part of my process when I'm worried about triteness and avoiding it. Whenever I think about the issue of triteness, that's a painful thought, and it's very discomforting. How to address this? In my own practice, I'm not always comfortable with what it is that I'm doing. And I vacillate back and forth between feeling very confident and very, quote, comfortable versus restless and unsure and not so confident. I think there's no way to be in one space or the other by itself. For me, it's a back and forth sort of thing. What I want to say about that, Mary, is that I take solace in knowing that I'm a patient, persistent painter, that even though I might lose a great many passages that I once felt were successful, I know that that's part of my journey with a given piece. And that if I don't bring it off today or tomorrow or next week, that eventually through patience and through persistence, I'm going to make something that I can feel good about. And it isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's not. And I'm not able to stay in one emotion or the other for a very long period of times. I'm literally vacillating back and forth between, yes, I'm confident, this is great, I love where this is going, and then I hit a snag, or I put the wrong move in, or I get rid of something that I realize later I should not have. That is just this back and forth. But I come back to this idea, Mary, that it's what Magnus Martin was saying, that the false steps it's just another step along the way. It may appear to be a false step, but it was a necessary step. It took me to the next place, you see. And whether it was a blunder or a brilliant move, it's still just the next step. And it isn't until all the steps are done, and as Susan said, there's a resistance to touch the canvas again, that's when we realize, I think I've arrived. I think it may be working now. And that's a process.
As Renee's saying, it's like the painting now has its own energy and it's pushing back.
Brilliant. I like that. It has its own energy and it's pushing. So don't touch me anymore, please. That's brilliant. And I love that. Yeah.
Okay, so one more question to go back to the topic of the critique. Please speak about how to regain confidence when one gets negative feedback.
So the question is, on the topic of critique, please speak about how to regain confidence when one gets a negative feedback. I guess my first response, Joan, would be consider the source. So that's important, to consider the source of the critique. If it's just someone whose opinion, let me put it this way. If it's someone whose opinion you really, truly respect, that's an important source to listen to. And I don't think it has to shatter one's confidence to be able to accept criticism. I think it takes a great deal of confidence to do that. So you obviously, when you hear that strong criticism, you have to filter it and you have to digest it. You have to chew on it. You have to take it back to the studio and really chew on it. And you have to weigh it out and sift it. You have to sift out. Whatever is true for you eventually is going to make its way through and into you, and then you might take that criticism to heart and do something. But it takes as you say, it takes a certain amount of confidence to ignore the criticism. But again, I come back to, Joan, this idea of considering the source. If it's someone whose opinion you don't know that much about, or maybe maybe let's say, okay, I'm going to be...
Someone walks in,
or maybe it's a painter who, I'm sorry, is a mediocre painter. I'll just use the term. A lot of mediocrity in the world. So what? And no, I'm being honest. Mediocrity, no one wants to talk about it, but it's an important subject because a lot of work that's in the world is mediocre. So what? But if you're talking to a painter who's really someone you respect and admire, that's a different kind of opinion than one from a mediocre painter. And I'll use the word, it's harsh, but it's true. I'm just being honest. I would take great umbrage if someone whose work doesn't do much for me, they come in and they look at my work and they make a criticism. I may give that some consideration, but I'm not going to give it the same weight as someone whose work I truly respect and admire. I'm going to give more weight to that criticism. I'm sorry. That's just how it is. So I think, and then I have to go back in the studio and look really hard. Maria is a good example. I respect her. I've seen her work as a painter, and it's quite strong. So when she says something, I give it some really serious consideration. So I don't know if this has answered your question or not. Can you let me know if you can, whether this helps or not?
Yeah, and I like that Susan says it's so helpful to know that my discomfort at times is normal.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is tough work. It's tough work. All of this.
And I love what Shiloh says. I guess I know when a painting is finished when I really love it, and I don't care if anyone else likes it or not.
Great.
That kind of
That's
sums it
great.
up.
I like that. Thank you for that, Sheila. Shiloh. That's Shiloh.
Shiloh,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's good, Shiloh. Very nice.
Okay, so have a great summer, everyone. Please keep following Mark's Facebook page and Instagram. We'll be posting as we travel through Europe. Mark is conducting a 10-day workshop in Italy starting May 30th till June 9th. So we will be reporting from there. I know internet is a little spotty because we're in the mountains in this old, what used to be a monastery. So, but we will be chiming in. So if you want to keep on following Mark throughout Europe, please follow his Instagram, Marking Studio, and his Facebook page, Marking Studio as well. And we will see you again in the fall.